Evergreen Hollow had once lived up to its name, a place where winters shimmered with charm, where every December brought hand-carved ornaments, steaming cider at the corner bakery, and a small-town joy so warm people swore it could melt snow. But this year, the season felt different, as if someone had blown out the candle at the heart of the town. The first snowfall had dusted the streets, but it settled over a place that seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. The failed harvest in October had emptied barns and pantries alike, leaving farmers with little to sell and even less to celebrate. The town's only factory, an old woodcraft mill that had been passed down for generations, had shuttered suddenly, sending dozens of families scrambling to replace incomes they had counted on for years. The news had drained Evergreen Hollow of its usual glow long before the lights went up. Now, with Christmas only days away, the town looked as though it had given up on joy altogether. Storefront windows that once overflowed with tinsel and handmade wreaths now displayed only thin, half-hearted garlands. Some shops didn't bother decorating at all, an unspoken admission that they didn't know how much longer they'd be open. The bakery's windows, usually fogged with warmth and laughter, were clear and empty, revealing a lone baker sweeping flour from a counter that hadn't seen many customers that week. Children wandered through the square, their boots scuffing lightly across snow-dusted cobblestones. They paused at the town's lone Christmas tree, a frail, crooked thing placed in the center of the plaza as if out of obligation. Its decorations were mismatched, recycled from previous years, and sparse enough that branches showed through like ribs. One little boy pressed his mittened hands against a toy store window, staring at the only new doll displayed for sale. Even the doll seemed to stare back with a kind of weary acceptance that adults weren't much better off. Conversations in the streets were brief, voices low and laced with tension. People carried themselves as if the weight of the season, usually light, cheerful, had grown heavy enough to bow their shoulders. Faces were tired, eyes shadowed with quiet fear about bills, food, gifts they couldn't afford. Everyone pretended to be hopeful for the children's sake, but Evergreen Hollow's spirit had dimmed. This was the state of the town when the fella drifter arrived. He appeared just after sunset, when the sky had deepened to a twilight purple that swallowed the silhouettes of buildings. No one knew where he came from. One moment the road was empty, the next a lone figure stood at its end. His coat was old but clean, his boots dusty from travel. Snowflakes caught in the folds of his scarf, melting slowly as he walked. He moved through the town without a word, his presence drawing furtive glances. Evergreen Hollow wasn't accustomed to strangers, especially not in the weeks before Christmas, when every visitor was usually a familiar face returning home. But this man was different. Taller than most, quiet to the point of stillness, with eyes that reflected more experience than age. They had a way of taking in everything at once: the shuttered shops, the cracked decorations, the defeated expressions of passers-by. People stiffened as he passed. A woman tugged her child closer. A pair of teenagers fell silent mid-conversation. It wasn't hostility, just caution. The kind that grows naturally in a small town when misfortune has already struck two. Many times the drifter didn't react to any of it. He simply watched. He paused at the empty bakery, studying the lonely baker inside. He lingered near the toy store window, observing the boy who pressed his face against the glass. When the boy noticed him, the drifter gave a small nod, gentle, almost apologetic, before moving on. There was something in the way he walked, slow and deliberate, as though he was not merely passing through but searching for something he had lost long ago. A ghost of a memory, perhaps, or a promise once broken. He stood for several minutes in front of the crooked Christmas tree. Snow drifted softly around him, catching in his dark hair. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture eased, as though he recognized the sadness in the tree. or understood it in a way no one else did. To the people of Evergreen Hollow, he was a stranger. To some, a threat. To others, an omen. But to the town itself, its heartbeat cracked. Its spirit fractured. His presence was like the first warm current under a frozen lake. UNNOTICEABLE at first, but promising change. Asterisk, the drifter did not speak to anyone in Evergreen Hollow during his first few days, yet somehow, people began to sense his presence more and more, like a quiet note humming beneath the town's strange silence. He moved without hurry, neither hiding nor announcing himself, just existing at the edges of their routines. At first, townsfolk thought he was simply another traveler heading somewhere warmer for the winter. But he stayed. He walked the same snow-covered streets each morning, paused near the same dimly lit storefronts each evening, and always watched. Not intrusively, never invading anyone's space, but with a strange patience, as though he were waiting for something he couldn't name. His detachment unsettled some of the locals. Evergreen Hollow was used to reading people quickly. Here, a stranger's whole life story was usually known before supper. But the drifter revealed nothing. When someone nodded at him, he returned the gesture with a polite dip of his head. When a shopkeeper asked if he needed help, he murmured a soft "no, thank you," then stepped out into the cold again. He never lingered long enough for conversation to form. He didn't laugh, didn't complain, didn't seem rattled by the biting chill or the palpable gloom that hung over the town like low fog. If the town's hardships weighed on him at all, he didn't show it. He watched, listened, absorbed, but never reacted. Yet beneath his calm exterior, something shifted when he thought no one was looking. Small moments, barely noticeable unless one paid close attention. Sometimes he stood at the outskirts of the town square, gaze fixed on the crooked Christmas tree as though he were searching for something hidden among its patchy ornaments. Other times he paused outside the bakery, looking through the frosted glass with an expression that flickered, just for a breath, between ache and resignation. A few residents swore they saw him touch the back of his gloved hand to the wooden railing outside the old woodcraft mill, as though testing a memory embedded in the grain. But what truly caught the drifter's attention, what broke through his calm mask more than anything else, was the struggling Bennett family. They lived at the edge of Evergreen Hollow in a small, weather-beaten house whose roof sagged under the weight of each new snowfall. The father, once a mill worker, had lost his job when the factory closed. The mother spent her days tending to their two young children, doing her best to make thin soup stretch into full meals. Their clothes were patched and faded. Their Christmas decorations were nothing more than paper stars taped to the windows. Yet the family clung stubbornly to a thread of hope. Though it seemed to fray a little more each day, the drifter noticed them almost immediately. One morning, he saw the father chopping frozen firewood with a dull axe, his breath coming in harsh clouds. The drifter stood on the path for a long moment, his eyes tracking each slow, exhausted swing. He didn't move toward the family or offer help, but something in his gaze softened, as though he recognized a pain he had once carried himself. Another afternoon, he walked past just as the mother ushered the children back inside, her smile bright but brittle, her hands trembling with cold. The drifter paused mid-step, his brows tightening, his expression flickering with something like guilt or longing or both. Then he turned away, quickly, as if afraid of what he might do if he stayed. These glimpses, though brief, hinted at an internal struggle hidden beneath layers of practiced indifference. A past he had tried to outrun, a wound he had never fully healed. Something about the Bennetts, perhaps their resilience, perhaps their fear-stirred old memories in him, memories he had buried but never escaped. And slowly, Evergreen Hollow began to wonder, Who was this man who walked their streets with eyes that saw too much? Why did he watch people the way someone studies shadows for the shape of something forgotten? Was he simply passing through, waiting for the next stretch of road to call his name? Or was he tethered to the town by something unseen, by a purpose he hadn't yet revealed even to himself? Rumors began to circulate, whispered over cups of weak coffee or exchanged quietly at the general store. Some said he was a former soldier haunted by loss. Others believed he was searching for someone. A few even claimed he was a sign, an omen that things were about to change. But the truth remained locked behind the drifter's steady, unreadable eyes. He stayed, he watched, and with every silent step he took through Evergreen Hollow, the question grew larger, heavier, impossible to ignore. Was he merely a wanderer on his way to nowhere, or the spark of something the town desperately needed but didn't yet dare to hope for? The days in Evergreen Hollow settled into a fragile rhythm: cold mornings, quiet afternoons, long evenings where the town lights glowed dimly like fading embers. And through it all, the drifter continued his silent wanderings, observing but never intruding. If people noticed him more often now, they still kept their distance. He seemed a man made of frost and stillness, someone who would slip away as quietly as he had arrived. But even frost can carry a spark. It began with something so small. Most didn't notice it until later. The town's Christmas display, a modest arrangement of lights and wooden cutouts near the square, had been in disrepair for weeks. A few strands were dark, burned out or chewed through by age. The wooden frame of the nativity scene stood crooked after a storm had knocked it askew. Everyone meant to fix it, but everyone had bigger problems. Bills to pay, jobs to replace, meals to stretch. Christmas lights simply weren't a priority this year. One evening, after the town had settled into its exhausted quiet, the drifter stood for a long time before the broken display. Snow drifted around him in slow spirals. His breath fogged the air, but he didn't move, didn't shiver. Instead, he crouched, touching the loose wires with gloved fingers, examining the snapped hooks and weather-worn bulbs. Then, when no one was watching, he went to work. He straightened the wooden frame, tightening bolts with tools no one had noticed he carried. He replaced the broken bulbs, somehow producing spares from the depths of his pack. He tested wires, rewound frayed sections, and coaxed the old strands to life. By the time dawn crept over the rooftops, the nativity scene stood upright and proud once again. And when the lights flickered on at dusk, they glowed fully for the first time all season, warm, steady, and impossibly bright against the snow. A shopkeeper was the first to notice. "Someone fixed it," she murmured, wonder softening her tired voice. Word spread quietly from one passerby to another. No one claimed credit. No one had seen anything. And so, naturally, all eyes drifted subtly, uncertainly toward the stranger who walked the streets with watchful, calm steps. No one asked him directly. Evergreen Hollow was too polite, too unsure. But suspicion grew into curiosity, and curiosity into something the town hadn't felt in months. A flicker of hope. If one thing could be mended, maybe more could. If someone cared anyone at all, maybe Evergreen Hollow wasn't entirely forgotten by fortune. The next act came just days later, and it was harder to ignore. A heavy snowfall had blanketed the town overnight, piling thick drifts across the northern road, one of the few remaining ways for deliveries to enter Evergreen Hollow. The plow the town usually depended on had been broken since early winter, its engine refusing to turn over despite the mechanic's best efforts. The road closure meant families waiting for discounted fuel, food staples, and winter clothes would go without for yet another week. At dawn, people gathered near the edge of town, muttering anxiously, their breath forming clouds of worry in the frozen air. But the road wasn't blocked. Somehow, against reason, against weather, Against expectation, the packed snow had been cleared into neat, towering banks. The way through was open. The ground was smooth and walkable, as though carved by a careful, experienced hand. Tracks in the snow revealed the truth. Not from a machine, but from a man with a shovel. No one had the stamina for that kind of labor. Not without help. Not overnight. But one figure in Evergreen Hollow had the quiet strength, the strange timing, the habit of disappearing when work was finished, before anyone could process what it meant. The mechanic sprinted to the garage, shouting for others to follow. The broken town plow silent, cold, stubborn for weeks sat with its hood raised. Inside, the engine wiring had been reconnected, a missing bolt replaced, the fuel line repaired. Someone had spent hours fixing what no one else had been able to solve, but no tools were left behind. No footprints lingered nearby, only the faintest trace of warmth from a recently running engine. By mid-morning, the town was buzzing. Who had done these things? Who had worked through the night? Who had repaired what they thought beyond repair? Again, no answers. Just the quiet figure of the drifter, walking through the square with the same steady stride, neither seeking credit nor avoiding suspicion. He didn't smile when the townsfolk stared a little longer than usual. He didn't flinch when whispers trailed behind him. But for the first time, someone called out a soft thank you, just to see how he'd react. The drifter paused. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge it. But something subtle, a tension in his shoulders, eased. It was as though the frost around him had cracked just slightly, letting the smallest ember glow beneath. The town didn't know what he meant to them yet, but Evergreen Hollow had been given its first spark. Small, uncertain. Enough to warm the cold. Asterisk at first. Evergreen Hollow didn't know exactly what to do with the sudden kindness that had swept quietly through their weary streets. The repaired Christmas display, the cleared road, the fixed plow. Each act had arrived without fanfare, without fingerprints, without any explanation at all. But their impact lingered like warmth in a room long abandoned by fire. People talked, softly at first, then with increasing wonder. And slowly, almost shyly, the town began to shift. It started with small gestures. A farmer who had lost most of his crops left a bundle of firewood on the Bennett family's porch one cold morning. He didn't knock, didn't ask for recognition, just set it down and walked away. A group of teenagers cleared the snow off the church steps. Before Sunday service, something they hadn't volunteered to do all season, a pair of elderly sisters baked bread for 3 families they knew were struggling and left the loaves wrapped in cloth at their doorways. No one announced these acts. No one claimed them. Evergreen Hollow had begun to understand something profound. If one person could care, perhaps many could. If someone out there believed the town was worth saving, maybe they could believe it too. From this quiet realization grew something even more powerful. The sense that none of them were facing the winter alone. And though the drifter never stepped forward to accept gratitude, his influence lingered in every changed expression, every shared load, every spark of generosity that flickered back to life. The people watched him with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. He still kept to himself, moving with the same silent purpose. But now his presence felt less like a shadow and more like a guiding star hanging just above the horizon, unreachable. But steady. He was still a mystery. He still gave nothing away. But when the town saw him walk by, they didn't stiffen the way they once had. Some nodded. Some offered small smiles. A few brave souls even greeted him, though he responded only with quiet acknowledgement. Still, something in their hearts softened. He had shown them what one act of kindness could awaken. And the town, long weighed down by hardship, finally felt strong enough to stand again. As days passed, Evergreen Hollow began to knit itself back together, thread by fragile thread. Conversations lasted longer. Laughter appeared where it hadn't been heard in months. Children played in the snow without glancing nervously at their parents' worried faces. Even the lights strung across Main Street seemed to shine brighter, as though the bulbs had been waiting all along for the town to remember the meaning of warmth. The turning point came when a group of neighbors gathered outside the general store and began discussing Christmas. For weeks, they had avoided the subject like it was a wound. They couldn't afford the decorations they once made. They didn't have the resources for the grand traditions they used to cherish. And yet, as they stood their hands in their pockets, breaths clouding in the winter air, someone said the words everyone else had been holding back. We can still celebrate. Maybe we just do it together. It was a simple idea. Small, but it carried more power than anyone expected. Soon, plans began to take shape. Not elaborate ones. Evergreen Hollow didn't have the luxury for extravagance, but heartfelt, humble ones. Children volunteered to make ornaments out of pine cones and ribbons. A few skilled hands offered to bake pies and bread for a shared meal. The town's musicians, though rusty, agreed to gather for a Christmas Eve performance. Even the older residents, those who had seen the town through decades of winters, pulled out old strings of lights, replacing bulbs and untangling wires to hang them along fences and porches. The Christmas spirit wasn't reborn all at once. It wasn't loud or dazzling. Instead, it grew the way dawn does, softly, gradually, illuminating frost-bitten corners until warmth prevailed again. And through it all, the drifter watched from the edges, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders lifted slightly against the cold. He lingered near the square more often now, his gaze tracing the renewed life stirring through the streets. Though he didn't participate, he didn't walk away either. Something kept him tethered to Evergreen Hollow, some pull of memory, of purpose, of unspoken obligation. People didn't need to know his name to understand the truth. He had lit the first spark, they were tending the flame. Together, the town unfurled hope once more, slowly, gently, like a gift being unwrapped after years of waiting. And Christmas, once dimmed, began to glow again. Christmas Eve arrived in Evergreen Hollow not with grandeur or spectacle, but with a simple, glowing warmth that felt richer than any celebration the town had held before. Lights shimmered in windows, some crooked, some flickering, some made by hand, but each one burned with purpose. The town square hummed with life as families gathered, sharing food, stories, and shy smiles that had been absent for far too long. Children laughed as they placed their pine cone ornaments on the newly restored tree, proud of the beauty they had created together. And through it all, the drifter watched from a distance. He stood at the edge of the square, half hidden beneath the shadow of the old clock tower. Snow gathered on his coat and hat, softening his silhouette. He didn't move toward the crowd. He didn't join in the singing or step near the bonfire. Instead, he lingered quietly, observing the transformed town as though memorizing it not for the present, but for a future in which he would no longer be here. Something in the air told him his time in Evergreen Hollow was ending. He had never intended to stay. Wherever he had come from, whatever roads had shaped him, they all shared one truth. He was a man who drifted between places, arriving when he was needed, leaving when the work was done. And Evergreen Hollow, once fractured, fearful, and tired, no longer needed him. He slipped away before the first star rose above the rooftops. No one saw him depart. No footsteps marked the snow. No farewells whispered behind him. When the concert ended and the children were tucked into their parents' arms, someone finally noticed the quiet space where he had been standing. "He's gone," a woman murmured, scanning the street as though he might reappear in the swirl of snowflakes. "Maybe he was never meant to stay." An older man replied, but even in his absence, the drifter's presence lingered, not as a mystery, But as a memory woven into the evening's warmth, the town awoke the next morning to Christmas Day shining brighter than any they could remember. Snow blanketed Evergreen Hollow in soft white layers, and every window glowed with golden light. The people gathered again, not out of ceremony but out of habit, a new habit shaped by weeks of shared purpose. Coffee brewed in homes that once felt cold. Neighbors exchanged greetings as naturally as breath. Old rivalries dissolved into moments of quiet understanding. And gifts simple, practical, often handmade, passed from one pair of hands to another. Evergreen Hollow had changed, not temporarily but fundamentally. The hardships hadn't vanished overnight. The harvest hadn't magically returned. The factory hadn't reopened. But the weight of those burdens no longer pushed the town toward despair. Instead, the people leaned on each other, lifting what no single person could carry alone. Hope had become more than decoration, it had become a way of living. Weeks later, when the decorations were packed away and life returned to its winter routines, the transformation remained. The Bennett family found support from neighbors who helped repair their roof and keep their pantry stocked. The elderly sisters received help with their firewood in exchange for warm loaves of bread. The teenagers who once loitered with slouched shoulders took responsibility for clearing snow from community paths. And the shopkeeper who used to close early stayed open longer, greeting customers with renewed enthusiasm. As locals made an effort to support one another's businesses, Evergreen Hollow had become something rare, something strong. A town made not of brick and wood, but of compassion. And though the drifter never returned, stories of him wove into the fabric of the town's history. Some said he was an angel. Others believed he was a man running from a past he couldn't outrun. A few insisted he was just a wanderer who happened to arrive at the right time. But none of those explanations mattered, because Evergreen Hollow understood the real truth. The drifter had given them the greatest gift a stranger can offer, a reminder of what they already had but had forgotten. He showed them that kindness grows even in winter, that unity can be sparked by a single quiet act, and that hope once shared can warm an entire community. His departure wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A promise that the spirit he awakened would endure long after the last snow melted. And so, Evergreen Hollow carried its new strength forward, year after year, lighting their homes each Christmas not for tradition alone, but in honor of the silent visitor who had taught them that the brightest gifts are never wrapped, never purchased, and often arrive when most desperately needed. Evergreen's true gift wasn't a holiday miracle. It was the rediscovery of each other.